Good morning, Year 9. I hope you are well, and I hope that you had a lovely weekend. Today, we are going to continue our study of Romeo and Juliet, looking at one of the most important scenes of the text. We will revisit this when we get back to school, but it's important that we get a basis of understanding of this scene before we move on. So, before we get into the content, could you please copy down the title, the date, and the learning objective? Pause the video and get that down now for me, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you're ready to complete the do now. I would like you to answer these 5 questions in full sentences. Pause the video, complete that task now, please. Okay, if you're back, that means you're ready to make your purple pen corrections. As always, tick it if you got it right. If you got it wrong, give it a cross, but please make sure you write the correct answer down. So it is Tybalt who first discovers that there is a Montague at the Capulets feast. Romeo and Juliet metaphorically describe themselves as saint and pilgrim in their first conversation. Romeo and Juliet are devastated when each discovers whom the other is. We know that this moment was going to occur in 1.5 as it was foreboded by Romeo at the end of 1.4. 1.4 being scene 1, act 4, 1.5 being scene 1, act 5. Light and dark imagery is used in 1.5 to signify Juliet's superior beauty and the way in which she overshadows all other women. And that's something that we're going to continue to see today also. Pause the video and get any corrections that you need to down now. Okay, so today's lessons kind of broke into chunks. So Act 2 begins with a kind of mini prologue for the rest of the text, and then we see Act 2 Scene 1 and Act 2 Scene 2. The reason I'm combining them together is because we're going to talk about attitudes towards love, and we're going to do a contrast between characters. So that's why we're looking at these scenes in conjunction. So, like I just mentioned, we have a prologue at the beginning of Act 2. And just a reminder that this is said by the chorus, who aren't characters. They exist outside of the action, but they always provide useful information about what's to come, as seen in the prologue at the beginning of the text. So let's have a quick read of this. Now old desire doth in his deathbed lie, and young affection gapes to be his heir. That fair for which love groaned for and would die, with tender Juliet matched is now not fair. So he says that, the chorus say that Romeo's old desires, feelings, are dying in his deathbed lie. And this is also interesting because it foreshadows the death of Romeo at the hands of his love for Juliet, which is also foreshadowed in the original prologue. And now they said that a new affection, young affection, has come about. Then he says that he previously would have groaned for the beautiful Rosaline and said he would die for her, but she is nothing in comparison to Juliet. Tender Juliet, that term of affection to describe Juliet there. The chorus then goes on to say, now Romeo is beloved and loves again, alike bewitched by the charm of looks, but to his foe supposed he must complain, and she still loves sweet bait from fearful hooks. The chorus says that now someone loves Romeo and he's in love again. Both of them are falling for each other's good looks. But he has to make his speeches of love to a woman who's supposed to be his enemy, his foe, and she's been hooked by someone she should fear. The idea that the feud should overpower their love, but for Romeo and Juliet, their love is more important, which is an idea that's developed later in the scenes. Then we continue to see the chorus say, being held a foe, he may not have access to breathe such vows as lovers used to swear, and she as much in love her means much less to meet her new beloved anywhere. basically, but because he's an enemy, Romeo has no chance to see Juliet and say the things a lover normally says, so the normal vows because of the feud. And Juliet's just as much in love as he is, but she has even less opportunity to meet her lover. That's a kind of comment on the gender inequality that she experiences as a woman, and particularly in light of the fact that her family want her to marry Paris. And then we end this little prologue here with the rhyming couplet, but passion lends them power, time means to meet, tempering extremities with extreme sweet. So that love gives them power and time gives them a chance to meet, sweetening the extreme danger with this kind of this passion and this pleasure. This is kind of, a summary of the play whereby the lovers feel empowered to kind of break the rules and do the unthinkable, and that ultimately makes their fate of death sweeter. Just to notice here that the prologue in this act is also a sonnet that we saw in the original prologue. So that rhyme scheme here of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then the rhyming couplet at the end. So what I would like you to do is, from what we've just learned, I would like you to write a 3-sentence summary of the prologue underneath the subtitle prologue summary. So pause the video, write the subtitle, and then write 3 sentences to summarize this prologue. Okay, if you're back, that means you completed this, and we can move on to Act 2, Scene 1. So, Act 2, Scene 1, the men have left the feast, and Romeo decides that he simply cannot go home and he needs to go and see his love Juliet. So he climbs a wall bordering the Capulet property and he leaps down into the Capulet gardens. And Mercutio is just kind of annoyed at this point, but also a bit amused at how ridiculous Romeo's feelings are. So he mocks Romeo's feelings for Rosaline in quite an obscene speech. Now, the reason that it's obscene is because it involves a lot of references to sex and kind of sexual body parts. And that's something we're going to unpick today. It's a key theme in the text. So it's incredibly important that we handle it with maturity, particularly when we return to school next week in our discussions of the language used by characters, especially men, to describe their sexual interactions and desires for women. So let's get into Act 2, Scene 1. So this kind of throws us into the action where Mercutio is being horrible about Romeo's feelings and being kind of a hopeless romantic. And he's having this conversation with Benvolio, who's being a little bit more kind to Romeo. So Benvolio starts by saying, and if he hear thee, thou wilt anger him. He says that if Romeo hears what Mercutio is saying about his kind of approach to romance, that he's going to be angry. And then Mercutio says, this cannot anger him. It would anger him to raise a spirit in his mistress' circle of some strange nature, letting it there stand, till she had laid it and conjured it down, that were some spite. Mercutio saying, what I'm saying can't anger him. He would be angry if I summoned a strange spirit for Rosaline to engage in sexual activity with. That's what would make him angry, because the things that he is saying, he says, my invocation is fair and honest. What he's saying is correct, that Romeo needs to get over it. He says, in his mistress's name, I conjure only but to raise up him. He says that all I'm doing is saying that the name of the woman that he loves, to lure him out of the darkness, that Romeo is in a dark place due to his love. And then Benvolio says, come, he hath hid himself among these trees to be consorted with the humorous night. Blind is his love and best befits the dark. He's basically saying that he's keeping the night company. His love is blind for Rosaline, and therefore it belongs in the dark. The idea that your senses are numbed when you are that deep in love. and the idea that Romeo cannot see clearly because of his love. Mercutio says, if love be blind, love cannot hit the mark. Now will he sit under a medlar tree and wish his mistress were that kind of fruit as maids call medlars when they laugh alone. He says that if love is blind, it can't hit a target, but they've ultimately love has managed to hit Romeo. And then he compares the fruit on the tree to the female genitalia and saying that he wishes his mistress was the fruit on the tree for sexual purposes. Mercutio continues by saying, "O Romeo, that she were, oh that she were an open arse, thou a poprin pear. Romeo, good night, I'll go to my truckle bed. This field bed is too cold for me to sleep. Come, shall we go?" He says basically that he wishes that Romeo would just engage in sexual activity with Rosaline and kind of get over this love that he has for her. He says that he's then going to go home and ask Benvolio to go, and Benvolio says, "Go on, for 'tis in vain to seek him that means not to be found." Benvolio says there's no point in looking for him if he doesn't want to be found. He's happy to be on his own right now. So, like I said, Mercutio's speech here is quite outrageous and quite imaginative as usual, as he teases Romeo and he seizes every opportunity to make sexual puns in relation to women and also in relation to Romeo's lack of kind of sexual desire or passion for women. So just kind of unpick a couple of things here about Romeo's wordplay. So we have the idea of a mistress's circle that links to women's genitalia, as well as the medlar, which is an apple-like fruit that hangs from the tree, again linking to kind of female sexual organs. The same with the phrase open arse. Which is slang for medlar, and again, therefore referencing female sexual organs. Then we also have a reference to the poprin pear here, and now this is a pear that is shaped like a male genitalia. So that is a quite explicit reference to sexual intercourse. He said, if love be blind, love cannot hit the mark. So the wordplay here is that love, like kind of the reference to Cupid in Cupid being able to strike his arrow and hit the mark, which he has done with Romeo. But then Mercutio is also saying that love cannot hit the mark, which means when you are in love, you cannot hit the target, which is having sexual intercourse, and that's what Romeo cannot do. We also have the idea of my invocation is fair and honest. Like I said earlier, we have two meanings here. We have one meaning being that what Mercutio is saying about Romeo's love is correct and proper. And this is also a reference to a proper woman. The idea that a woman must be untouched, must be a virgin to be a honest and proper woman. We then have this idea, this kind of extended metaphor for sexual intercourse. So we to raise a spirit in his mistress's circle, again a reference to a woman's genitalia, and then we have the idea of standing and then coming down. So that's the idea of the beginning of sexual intercourse and the end of sexual intercourse and that journey for a man. Now, a lot of this you wouldn't understand unless I was to explain it to you, and that's the kind of beauty of it for Mercutio. He knows that he is speaking quite kind of formally, and he's playing on the mixed meaning of quite a few words, but inherently he has a quite outrageous and obscene view of sex, but his clever use of language kind of shields that almost. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail later on in the lesson. So now we're going to look at Act 2, Scene 2 and see a very different attitude towards love and a very different use of language to present love. So in this scene, it's the famous balcony scene. I'm sure you probably all heard of some of the quotes that we're about to look at in the next few slides. So Juliet suddenly appears in a window above the spot where Romeo is standing, and Romeo's kind of, talking about his love to himself, and he nearly speaks to her, but then he decides that he shouldn't in case he gets caught. Juliet's then kind of doing the same thing as Romeo and musing to herself about her love. And she asks why Romeo must be Romeo. She says that if he would refuse the Montague name, she would give herself to him, or if he would simply swear that he loved her, she would refuse her Capulet name. Romeo responds then kind of pleading with Juliet, saying that he will do whatever it takes, and Juliet worries that Romeo will be murdered for being on Capulet land. She also worries that perhaps Romeo will prove inconstant or false, or will think Juliet is too easily won. And that's a really interesting point, considering, how quickly he forgot Rosaline for Juliet. Romeo begins to kind of swear his love to her, almost as if like to be married. And she stops him, again concerned that everything is happening very, very quickly, which is an audience concern that we share as well. Juliet then tells Romeo that she will send someone to him the next day to see if his love is true and honourable and if he intends to wed her. It's quite interesting here because normally, the woman would fall head over heels for the man, but this time it's kind of different. It's Juliet testing Romeo because Romeo is so deeply and passionately in love with her. So let's read this infamous scene. Before we do so, there is a lot of kind of imagery and metaphor that we need to unpick. So to do that, I would like you to copy this into your books on a clean half page. You might need a little bit more than a clean half page, depending on how big your writing is. Ultimately, you just need to create 5 different mind maps, one for night imagery, one for religious imagery, one for images of nature, one for light imagery, and one for astrological imagery. Pause the video and copy those kind of 5 mind maps down now. Okay, so you should have copied this down now. So as we go through and I explain key quotes to you, I want you to annotate off of them. You don't need to explain them, you just need to annotate the quotations. So just do a little arrow and then write the quote mark. Same again, do a little arrow and write the quote mark. So we can have a selection of quotes linked to imagery that will form great analysis. Let's get into reading. So we have Romeo beginning the scene. Kind of, he's heard Mercutio and Benvolio's conversations, and he says he jests at scars that never felt a wound. So he basically says it's easy for Mercutio to make these jokes about love because he's never been cut. He's never felt the pain, the scars, and the wounds that I have felt that I'm in love. At this point, Juliet enters on the Juliet enters a little bit later. Some versions it's a bit different. Sometimes Juliet enters here, sometimes Juliet enters a little bit later, but the idea is that he's talking aloud, but she cannot hear him. So he says, but soft what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun, the infamous line. He says, but wait, what's that light in the window over there? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. So importantly here, we have a direct reference to Juliet as a light, a shining light, and comparing Juliet to a sun. A metaphor here. It's not a simile because he doesn't say Juliet is as bright as the sun. He simply clarifies that she is the sun. And again, a reference to kind of her overwhelming beauty, and they almost lights up his life. He then says, "Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she." He says, "Rise up, beautiful sun, and kill the jealous moon, who is already pale and sick with grief because you are more beautiful than she is." Um, so this kind of image of Juliet being so beautiful that it makes the moon jealous, that she can kill the jealous moon. Then he switches the play, or he plays on words here. So he refers to Juliet being kind of a maid of the moon, um, and that's kind of a reference to the power of astronomy, which links to the ideas that the stars and astronomy are kind of higher powers that dictate our lives and they predetermine our fates. And then he links back to the word maid here, and then he says, "Don't be her maid, because she is jealous. She's envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off." Now, this phrase refers to Juliet's virginity, and he says that it makes her look sick and green, and only fools hold on to their virginity, and therefore that she should cast it off. So that's kind of the moment where we see Romeo switch into kind of that sexual bravado that we see commonly with other characters in the text, saying basically that he wants to engage in some kind of sexual activity with Juliet. Then Juliet appears aloft at a window, so she's kind of unaware that Romeo is below her. He says, "It is my lady, oh, it is my love, oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses, I will answer it." Basically says, "Oh, there's my lady, oh, it is my love." And these kind of short exclamatory phrases show his just absolute passion on seeing Juliet. He then says, "I wish she knew how much I love her." She's talking, but she's not saying anything. Her eyes are saying something, I will answer it. So maybe she's talking to the nurse or her mother, but Romeo is considering answering her. He then backtracks and says, "I am too bold, 'tis not to me she speaks. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven have some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return." He basically says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, I'm too bold, I'm being too confident, she's not speaking to me." Then he just continues basically talking about how beautiful she is, and says that two of the brightest stars in the whole sky had to go away on business, and they're asking her eyes to twinkle in their place until they return. Again, we have the reference to stars here. We also have the reference to her eyes and the beauty of her eyes, which we also looked at when they first met. So all of the language here and all of the imagery here is just directed towards Romeo's passion, affections, and devotions to what he believes is just an extraordinarily beautiful Juliet, and he can't find the language to express that. And there is a bit of a contrast here between the language surrounding sex, and women in general. Mercutio is a lot more kind of brazen, a lot more harsh, but Romeo is a lot more romantic in his exclamations of love. So then he says, "What if her eyes were there, they in her head, the brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright, that birds would sing and think it were not night." He asks, what if her eyes were in the sky and the stars were in her head? So the idea that the stars have actually replaced her eyes. He then talks about her cheek, which again we looked at in Act 1, Scene 5, with a comparison between the dangling of the earring on her cheek. He says the brightness of her cheeks would outshine the stars, as daylight doth a lamp, the way that the sun outshines a lamp. Then he says, if her eyes were in heaven, if her eyes were in the night sky, they would shine so brightly through space that birds would start singing. I'm just kind of laughing here because could you just imagine someone saying this to you or to themselves? Um, then he says, see how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that were I a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. He basically just wishes that he was the hand, the glove on her hand as she is leaning on it. So the idea that he kind of wants to like caress her cheek with affection. Again, we have a lot of kind of incredibly hyperbolic description of his love towards Juliet here. The fact that if her eyes were in the sky, they would be so bright that birds would start singing, and thinking her light was the light of day. So, literally comparing her eyes to the sunrise. And then Juliet hears or sees him and says, I me, which is just a kind of like, oh my God, who's that? And then aside, he says, she speaks, oh, speak again, bright angel, for thou art as glorious to this night, being over my head, as is a winged messenger of heaven, unto the white upturned wondering eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him, when he bestrides the lazy puffing clouds and sails upon the bosom of the air. So here he says, he just begs that she speaks more, refers to her as a bright angel, so that celestial kind of almost religious imagery there. And then he says that she is as glorious as an angel, a winged messenger, that kind of shines above him. So this idea that kind of she shines like a star, a sun, like an angel. It's almost like he can't actually think of enough ways to describe how beautiful she is. She basically said, and then he basically says she shines so bright that she makes mortals fall on their backs to look up at the sky to watch the angel walking on the clouds. And that's particularly interesting given the setting here, because Juliet is up on the balcony and Romeo is below. So that image of her literally being a celestial being above him, and he's gazing up at her, kind of walking through the clouds. And it's important to notice here this imagery surrounding birds and this natural image of the birds. Now, she is described as being this free bird here that flies through the sky, but in fact, Juliet is a caged bird. She has a lack of freedom as a woman, and also as a daughter to a noble man. So then Juliet continues kind of on the balcony to muse about her love for Romeo, not speaking directly at him still. She says very famously, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Basically says, why do you have to be Romeo? Then she says, deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. He basically says, forget about your father, get rid of your name, or if you won't do that, swear to me that you love me and I'll no longer be a Capulet. So this is incredibly kind of unheard of, two very noble children from noble families in a deep feud who are claiming that they will no longer be a part of that family after one meeting of each other. So either that signifies the depth of their love or the stupidity of their love. I'll let you be the judge. And then Romeo says again, shall I hear more or shall I speak at this? He's like, shall I let her go on or shall I speak to her and let her know that I'm here? Juliet says, tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself, thou not a Montague. She basically says that only your name is posing a problem and I would still love you if you stopped being a Montague. And then she kind of stops herself and she says, what's Montague? Is it not hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man? Oh, be some other name. What's in a name? So she basically says, like, what even is a Montague? It's not a part of Romeo. It can be removed from him. And then she begs that he's some other name. And she says, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. She basically says the thing that we call a rose would be as sweet as a rose if we called it by another name. And this signifies the insignificance of the feud. It doesn't matter about names, it matters about the inherent characteristics of someone, which is the message that Juliet's trying to get across. She then compares this directly to Gumio, that's like a ship name, Gumio, to Romeo by saying, so Romeo would here, were he not Romeo called, retain the dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo would still be perfect if he wasn't called Romeo. Then she says, Romeo, doff thy name, and for thy name, which is no part of thee, take all myself. He basically says, trade your name and take all of me in exchange, which is again a reference to kind of marriage as a business transaction. That's what Juliet thinks. For Romeo's name, she will give herself to him in her entirety. So if you need to pause the video now and go back through and get any of the imagery jotted down, please do so. If not, we can move on. Okay, so now what I would like you to do is write the subheading contrasting attitudes to love. Underneath that, you're going to write a mini analytical paragraph. I'll explain that to you in a second, but pause the video, write the subheading, and then come back. Okay, so a mini analytical paragraph here is going to be used to compare Romeo's and Mercutio's attitude to love, as we've seen both of them express their views in this lesson. So this is how you're going to do it. You're going to do a clear idea about Mercutio's attitude to love, then you're going to embed a quote, one of the puns or the sexual bravados that I highlighted earlier on. And then you're going to analyse what it suggests about Mercutio's attitude to love. You don't need to write a three-idea sentence, you just need to say the word or the simile or the pun suggests that, and then tell me what it says about Mercutio's attitude to love. Then you're going to mimic the same three-step process for Romeo. What is Romeo's attitude to love? Then embed a quote using one of the pieces of imagery that you've got down on your mind map, and then again analysing what it suggests. And then finally, you're going to conclude with a sentence about how they are contrasted. So on one hand, Romeo is da-da-da, and on the other hand, Mercutio is da-da-da. So that is our mini analytical paragraph. Pause the video and spend the remainder of the lesson completing this task. Okay, if you're back, that means you're ready to submit. Please make sure you submit to my email. I should be getting no submissions to my Show My Homework. I don't check Show My Homework messages very often. I only check it for quizzes, so please don't submit it there because it gets lost amongst all the notifications. Make sure your subject looks like this and then attach your work. Once you've done that, you can X out of the video and continue with your learning. Well done. I will speak to you in tomorrow's lesson.